They were famous once. Their names filled theaters, topped charts, made headlines around the world, and then they were lowered into the ground with nothing to mark the spot, no stone, no name, no dates. Tonight, we're visiting the chilling graves of celebrities who were never given a headstone. Some lay nameless for decades. Some lie nameless still. Let's begin. We begin with one of the most haunting cases in all of Hollywood history. A woman who was, for a brief and dazzling moment, the very first movie star the world ever knew. Florence Lawrence was called the Biograph Girl, and in 1910 she became the first film actor in history to be known to the public by name, at a time when studios deliberately kept their performers anonymous. She was born in Canada in 1886 and appeared in nearly 300 films, an enormous star at the dawn of cinema, earning a fortune and inventing the very concept of the movie celebrity. But her fame did not last. A serious injury on a film set, changing tastes, and the relentless churn of the young industry pushed her aside, and by the 1930s, she was reduced to bit parts and extra work at MGM, largely forgotten by the very medium she had helped create. Alone, ill, and despairing over her fading career and failing health, Florence Lawrence died by suicide in 1938 at just 52 years old, swallowing ant paste in her Beverly Hills home. And here is the chilling part. The woman who had been the world's very first movie star was buried in an unmarked grave at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, with no headstone, no name, nothing at all to indicate that the first celebrity in the history of film lay beneath the ground. She remained nameless for more than 50 years, her grave a patch of empty grass. Until finally, in 1991, a British actor who admired her paid for a simple marker to be placed at last. So the very first movie star, the woman who invented fame itself, lay forgotten and nameless for half a century, her chilling, anonymous grave a symbol of how completely the industry she built had erased her. We travel now to honor a legendary blues musician whose recordings became the foundation of rock and roll, and whose grave was lost so completely that no one today can say for certain where he lies. Robert Johnson is the most mythologized figure in the history of the blues. A Mississippi Delta musician who recorded just 29 songs before his death and whose haunting guitar and voice influenced virtually every rock musician who followed. He was born in Mississippi around 1911. And so little is certain about his short life that legend has filled every gap. Most famously, the story that he sold his soul to the devil at a midnight crossroads in exchange for his supernatural musical gift. His recordings, made in makeshift studios in 1936 and 1937, are considered sacred texts of American music, and his songs have been covered by the greatest names in rock. But Robert Johnson died in 1938 at just 27 years old, poisoned, according to the most accepted account, with strychnine-laced whiskey by the jealous husband of a woman he had been seeing, dying in agony over 3 days. He was a poor, itinerant black musician in the segregated Deep South, and he was buried without ceremony and without a headstone, in an unmarked grave whose exact location was immediately lost. For decades, no one knew where he lay. Today, there are 3 separate graves near Greenwood, Mississippi, each marked with a memorial stone placed by admirers, each claiming to be his true resting place, because the real one can never be confirmed. So the man who laid the foundation for rock and roll, one of the most influential musicians who ever lived, was buried nameless in the Mississippi earth, his true grave lost forever, marked now by 3 competing stones that only deepen the chilling mystery of where he truly rests. We travel now to honor a jazz genius who was, by the account of everyone who heard him, the very first man to play jazz, and who died forgotten in an asylum and was buried in a pauper's grave. Buddy Bolden was a New Orleans cornet player who, around the turn of the 20th century, essentially invented the music that would become jazz, improvising and bending notes in ways no one had heard before, so loud and so powerful that legend said you could hear him playing from across the city. He was born in New Orleans in 1877 and became the most famous musician in the city, the man that later jazz giants like Jelly Roll Morton pointed to as the founder of it all. But Buddy Bolden never made a single recording that survives, and his mind began to collapse when he was still a young man. Suffering from severe mental illness and paranoia, he was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum in 1907 at just 30 years old, and he remained there, silent and forgotten, for the next 24 years, never playing again. Buddy Bolden died in that asylum in 1931 at 54, having spent more than half his life confined and forgotten by the world that his music had transformed. Because he was a poor black man who died in a state institution, his body was sent back to New Orleans and buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at Holt Cemetery, a potter's field for the poor, with no headstone and no marker of any kind. His exact resting place within the cemetery was lost, and though a memorial marker was eventually placed at an approximate spot, the true grave of the founder of jazz remains unknown, a chilling anonymity for the man who started it all. We travel now to honor a hugely popular silent film star whose life ended in tragedy and whose grave went unmarked for nearly a century. Florence Labadie, a hugely popular silent film star whose life ended in tragedy and whose grave went unmarked for nearly a century. She was born around 1888 and became one of the most popular actresses in America in the early 1910s. A major star for the Thanhouser Company, beloved by millions and appearing in hundreds of films at the height of the silent era. She was known for performing her own daring stunts, a fearless and adventurous performer at a time when the movies were still brand new. But in the summer of 1917, Florence Labadie was gravely injured when the brakes failed on her automobile and it crashed, and after weeks of suffering, she died of her injuries and complications. She was just 29 years old, one of the first major movie stars to die at the height of her fame. And in a chilling turn, this hugely popular actress was buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in a grave that, for reasons lost to history, went completely unmarked for almost 100 years. It was not until 2014 that admirers and historians finally placed a headstone on her long-forgotten grave, restoring at last the name of a star who had lain nameless for nearly a century. We travel now to honor the Empress of the Blues, one of the greatest singers in American history, whose grave went unmarked for more than 3 decades. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, one of the greatest and most influential singers in the history of American music, whose grave went unmarked for more than 3 decades after her death. She was born in Tennessee around 1894, into deep poverty, and rose to become the highest-paid black performer of the 1920s, a towering figure whose powerful voice and commanding presence made her the most famous blues singer in America, selling millions of records and influencing generations of singers who followed. But the Great Depression and changing tastes eroded her career, and in 1937 Bessie Smith was killed in a car accident on a highway in Mississippi, suffering catastrophic injuries. She was around 43 years old. Her funeral in Philadelphia drew thousands of mourners, an outpouring of grief for a beloved icon. And yet, chillingly, her grave was left completely unmarked for the next 33 years, the Empress of the Blues lying nameless in the ground while her records continued to sell and her influence continued to grow. It was not until 1970 that a headstone was finally placed on her grave, paid for in part by the singer Janis Joplin, who idolized her and who would herself be dead just months later. So, one of the greatest singers who ever lived lay in a nameless grave for more than 3 decades. Her chilling anonymity finally ended by another doomed singer who understood her genius. We travel now to honor a beloved child star of early Hollywood whose life ended in addiction and despair, and whose body lay in a mass grave for a year before anyone even knew he was dead. Bobby Driscoll was one of the most gifted child actors in the history of Hollywood, the voice and model for Disney's Peter Pan and the winner of a Special Academy Award, whose fall from stardom was one of the most heartbreaking in film history. He was born in Iowa in 1937 and became a major star as a boy, appearing in beloved Disney films like Song of the South and Treasure Island, adored by millions of children across America. But when he reached adolescence, Disney abruptly dropped him, and the boy who had been a star found himself rejected, bullied, and unable to find work. He spiraled into drug addiction as a teenager and young man, his life collapsing completely. By his late 20s, Bobby Driscoll was destitute, forgotten, and living among addicts in New York City. In March 1968, his body was discovered by 2 children playing in an abandoned tenement in the East Village. He had died of heart failure brought on by his addiction. He was just 31 years old. And here is the chilling part. He carried no identification, no one came forward to claim him, and no one recognized the forgotten former star. Bobby Driscoll, who had once won an Academy Award, was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, in a mass grave on Hart Island, New York City's Potter's Field, for the unclaimed dead. It was more than a year later, when his mother tried to find him, that his fingerprints finally revealed the truth. but his body was never recovered from the mass grave. The boy who was Peter Pan lies still in that nameless island trench, and only a memorial marker beside his father's grave in California bears his name. We travel now to honor the groundbreaking actress who became the first Black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, and whose ashes lie in a modest niche after a lonely death. Dorothy Dandridge, the groundbreaking actress and singer who became the first Black woman nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress, and whose ashes lay in a modest resting place after a tragic and lonely death. She was born in Cleveland in 1922 and rose to become one of the most beautiful and talented performers in Hollywood. A genuine trailblazer whose electrifying performance in Carmen Jones made history in 1954. But Hollywood offered painfully few roles to a Black leading lady in that era, and despite her groundbreaking success, Dorothy Dandridge found her career stalling, her opportunities limited by the racism of the industry. Financial ruin, a failed marriage, and depression shadowed her final years. In September 1965, Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her apartment of what was ruled an accidental overdose or an embolism. She was just 42 years old, and she died with only a few $100s to her name, a tragic and lonely end for a woman who had broken barriers. She was cremated, and her ashes were placed at Forest Lawn in Glendale, in a modest niche. For a woman who had made such history, who had opened doors for every Black actress who followed, her resting place remained little known and seldom visited for many years. A quiet and understated marker for a trailblazer whose monumental achievements deserved so much more recognition than the world had given her in life or in death. We travel now to honor one of the most extraordinary musical prodigies in American history, an enslaved and exploited pianist whose grave was long disputed and neglected. Blind Tom Wiggins, one of the most extraordinary musical prodigies in American history, an enslaved and later exploited pianist whose staggering genius made him famous around the world, and whose grave was long disputed and poorly marked. He was born blind and enslaved in Georgia in 1849, and he displayed an almost supernatural musical ability from earliest childhood, able to reproduce any piece of music perfectly after a single hearing, and to compose original works of great complexity, despite being autistic in an age that had no understanding of his condition. He was exhibited across America and Europe as a performing marvel, generating enormous fortunes that went almost entirely to the white families who controlled him, first as his enslavers and later as his legal guardians, exploiting him mercilessly throughout his life. Blind Tom Wiggins was one of the most famous performers of the 19th century, yet he never saw the wealth his genius created. He died in 1908 at 59, still under the control of others. And in a chilling reflection of how completely he had been exploited, his grave was long, uncertain, and disputed, with competing claims about where his remarkable body actually lay, the true resting place of one of history's greatest prodigies, obscured and neglected for generations. We travel now to honor a beautiful and talented star of the silent screen whose life was destroyed by addiction, her grave marked only modestly after a tragic early death. Alma Rubens, a beautiful and talented star of the silent screen whose life was destroyed by drug addiction and whose story became a cautionary tale, her grave marked only modestly after a tragic early death. She was born in San Francisco in 1897 and became a major star of the silent era, a striking and gifted actress who appeared opposite the biggest leading men of her day and seemed destined for lasting stardom. But Alma Rubens became addicted to heroin and cocaine, an addiction that consumed her in the 1920s and played out with terrible publicity as she was in and out of sanatoriums and made desperate, public attempts to get clean. Her decline was one of the first great drug tragedies of Hollywood, splashed across the newspapers of the era. In January 1931, Alma Rubens died of pneumonia, her body weakened by years of addiction, at just 33 years old. In her final months, she had written a searing memoir warning others about the drugs that were killing her. She was one of the earliest Hollywood stars to be destroyed by addiction, a pattern that would repeat itself tragically across the decades that followed. Her resting place at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles received little attention for many years, her name and her cautionary story fading from memory as the industry moved on and forgot the beautiful, doomed star whose life it had helped to ruin. We travel now to honor the father of the Delta Blues, one of the most influential musicians in American history, whose grave lay unmarked for more than half a century. Charlie Patton, widely regarded as the father of the Delta blues, one of the most important and influential musicians in American history, whose grave lay unmarked for more than half a century. He was born in Mississippi around 1891 and became the most famous and charismatic bluesman of the Mississippi Delta, a powerful performer whose driving rhythms, growling voice, and showmanship influenced virtually every Delta blues musician who followed, including Robert Johnson and Howlin' Wolf. His recordings from the late 1920s and early 1930s are foundational documents of American music, and his influence echoes through the blues and rock that came after him. But Charlie Patton was a poor black musician in the segregated South, and when he died of heart failure in 1934 at around 43 years old, he was buried in a small cemetery near Holly Ridge, Mississippi, in a grave that went completely unmarked. For more than 50 years, the father of the Delta blues lay nameless in the Mississippi earth, his monumental contributions to music uncelebrated and his resting place forgotten. It was not until 1990 that a headstone was finally placed on his grave, paid for by the musician John Fogerty, in tribute to the man whose music had shaped his own. So one of the most important figures in the entire history of American music lay in a nameless grave for over half a century. A chilling reflection of how the country forgot the black pioneers who created its greatest art. We travel now to honor one of the most beloved black entertainers of the 1920s, a Broadway sensation whose grave went unmarked for the better part of a century. Florence Mills, one of the most beloved and celebrated black entertainers of the 1920s, a dazzling singer and dancer who was a sensation on Broadway and in Europe, and whose grave went unmarked for the better part of a century. She was born in Washington, D.C. in 1896 and rose to become one of the biggest stars of the Harlem Renaissance, a beloved performer whose charm, talent, and grace made her an international sensation and a symbol of black artistic achievement, adored by audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. She used her fame to advocate for civil rights and racial equality, a courageous stance in her era. But Florence Mills drove herself relentlessly, and in 1927, exhausted from overwork, she died suddenly after an operation, at just 31 years old. Her funeral in Harlem was one of the largest the neighborhood had ever seen, with an estimated 150,000 mourners lining the streets to honor the beloved star, and a plane releasing blackbirds overhead in tribute to her signature song. And yet, chillingly, despite this outpouring of love, her grave at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx went unmarked for decades. The dazzling star, who had been mourned by 150,000 people, lying nameless in the ground, her fame fading until admirers finally worked to restore recognition to her long-forgotten resting place. We travel now to honor the King of Ragtime, one of the most important composers in American history, whose grave lay unmarked for nearly 50 years. Scott Joplin, the King of Ragtime, one of the most important composers in American history, whose immortal compositions defined an entire era of music, and whose grave lay unmarked for nearly 50 years. He was born in Texas around 1868, the son of a formerly enslaved father, and he became the most celebrated composer of ragtime music, his compositions like The Entertainer and Maple Leaf Rag becoming enormously popular and defining the sound of turn-of-the-century America. He dreamed of being recognized as a serious composer and poured his final years into an ambitious opera. But the musical establishment of his era refused to take a black ragtime composer seriously, and his grand ambitions were repeatedly frustrated. Worn down by disappointment and by illness, Scott Joplin died in 1917 at around 48 years old, in a mental institution in New York, his health destroyed by syphilis. And in a chilling reflection of how little his own time valued him, the King of Ragtime was buried in an unmarked grave at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, lying nameless for nearly half a century. It was not until 1974, when a revival of his music, spurred by the film The Sting, made him famous all over again, that a proper headstone was finally placed on his grave, restoring at last the name of one of America's greatest composers. We travel now to honor one of the most beautiful and popular stars of the silent screen, a former Ziegfeld girl whose shocking death became one of Hollywood's first great tragedies. Olive Thomas, one of the most beautiful and popular stars of the silent screen, a former Ziegfeld girl whose dazzling career and shocking death made her one of Hollywood's first great tragedies. She was born in Pennsylvania in 1894 and rose from poverty to become a celebrated artist's model and a star of the Ziegfeld Follies, renowned as one of the most beautiful women in America, before becoming a hugely popular film actress and marrying into Hollywood royalty as the wife of Mary Pickford's brother Jack. She was, by 1920, one of the brightest young stars in the film industry, adored by fans and seemingly destined for lasting fame. But in September 1920, while on a second honeymoon in Paris, Olive Thomas died after ingesting a poison, mercury bichloride, in circumstances that have never been fully explained, whether by tragic accident or despair. She was just 25 years old, and her death, wrapped in scandal and mystery, became one of the first great tragedies of the young film industry. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, and though she had been one of the most famous women in America, her grave and her memory faded with the passing decades. The dazzling young star whose life ended so mysteriously in Paris, slipping quietly from public memory, her resting place seldom visited, and her tragic story known today only to devoted students of Hollywood's earliest and most haunted years. We travel now to honor the controversial but historic performer who became the first black actor to become a millionaire in Hollywood, his complicated legacy leading to a long-neglected grave. Lincoln Perry, known professionally as Stepin Fetchit, a controversial but historically significant performer who became the first black actor to become a millionaire in Hollywood, and whose complicated legacy and lonely final years led to a long-neglected grave. He was born in Florida in 1902 and rose to enormous fame in the 1930s, becoming the first black actor to receive featured screen credit and to build genuine wealth in Hollywood, a groundbreaking achievement, even as the shuffling, subservient character he played would later be condemned as a demeaning racial stereotype. He earned and spent a fortune, living lavishly at the height of his fame. But as attitudes changed and his style of performance became rightly criticized, his career collapsed, and he lost his money and his standing, spending his later decades in obscurity and financial hardship. Lincoln Perry died in 1985 at 83, having lived long enough to see his legacy fiercely debated, a pioneer and a painful symbol at once. His resting place at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles received little recognition for a man who had, whatever the controversy of his roles, genuinely broken barriers as the first black millionaire actor in Hollywood, his complicated and consequential life fading into the quiet neglect that so often claims the pioneers whom history struggles to know how to remember. We travel now to honor one of the most powerful and influential gospel blues performers in history, whose grave went unmarked after a heartbreaking death in poverty. Blind Willie Johnson, one of the most powerful and influential gospel blues performers in American history, whose haunting slide guitar and gravelly voice reached across the ages, and whose grave went unmarked after a heartbreaking death in poverty. He was born in Texas around 1897 and, blinded as a child, became a street corner evangelist whose recordings of sacred songs, sung in his unforgettable rough voice over his masterful slide guitar, became some of the most moving music ever recorded. His performance of the song "Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground" is so profound that it was included on the Voyager Golden Record, launched into deep space to represent humanity to the cosmos, meaning his music will outlast the Earth itself. But Blind Willie Johnson lived and died in poverty. When his home burned down, he had nowhere else to go, and he continued living in the ruins, sleeping on a wet bed, until he contracted a fatal illness. Because he was black and blind and poor, he was reportedly refused treatment at a hospital, and he died in 1945 at around 48 years old. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Texas, its exact location uncertain. The man whose music now travels among the stars, lying nameless and forgotten in the earth of his home state, one of the most chilling contrasts between earthly neglect and cosmic immortality in all of music history. We travel now to honor the silent film actress whose death became one of Hollywood's most notorious scandals, her grave long neglected while her name was dragged endlessly through the mud. Virginia Rappe, the silent film actress whose death became one of the most notorious scandals in Hollywood history, and whose grave went largely neglected for decades, even as her name was dragged endlessly through the mud. She was born in Chicago in 1891 and became a model and actress in the 1910s, a working performer in the young film industry who appeared in a number of pictures and was, by 1921, building a modest career. But her name became infamous not for her work but for her death. In September 1921, at a party in San Francisco hosted by the comedian Fatty Arbuckle. Virginia Rapé fell ill, and she died days later of a ruptured bladder. Arbuckle was accused of causing her death, and the sensational trials that followed, though they ended in his acquittal, destroyed his career and made Virginia Rapé's name a permanent fixture of Hollywood scandal. Lost in all the lurid coverage was the fact that a real young woman, just 30 years old, had died. She was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and her grave, associated forever with scandal rather than with her own life and work, was long neglected and poorly tended. The real woman, all but erased behind the notorious story of her death. A chilling reminder of how a person can be reduced to a scandal and forgotten as a human being. We travel now to honor a gentle and beloved bluesman rediscovered late in life, only to die soon after. His grave marked simply in the rural Mississippi he never left. Mississippi John Hurt, a gentle and beloved bluesman whose soft voice and intricate guitar picking made him a treasure of American folk music, rediscovered late in life, only to die soon after. His grave marked simply in the rural Mississippi he never left. He was born in Mississippi around 1893 and recorded a handful of songs in the 1920s before returning to a quiet life as a sharecropper. His brief recording career forgotten for decades. Then, in the 1960s, folk revival enthusiasts, using clues in his old songs, astonishingly tracked him down, still living in the tiny community of Avalon, Mississippi, and brought him to national fame at last, where his warmth, humility, and extraordinary musicianship made him a beloved figure of the folk revival. For a few short years, Mississippi John Hurt finally received the recognition he had always deserved, performing at festivals and recording new albums to acclaim. But the rediscovery came late. Mississippi John Hurt died in 1966, only a few years after his return to music, at around 73 years old. He was buried near his home in rural Mississippi, in a small and remote cemetery far from the world that had briefly embraced him. His grave, in the quiet countryside he loved, remained a modest and hard-to-find marker for years, the gentle master of the country blues resting in the same rural earth where he had spent his obscure and humble life. We travel now to honor a stunningly beautiful star of the silent screen known as the girl who was too beautiful, whose reckless, tragic life ended at just 29. Barbara Lamar, a stunningly beautiful star of the silent screen known as the girl who was too beautiful, whose reckless, tragic life ended at just 29, and whose grave, in a crowded mausoleum, is seldom sought out today. She was born in 1896 and became one of the most glamorous and talked about actresses of the early 1920s, a genuine sex symbol whose dark beauty and scandalous private life made her a sensation, famous for reportedly declaring that she slept only 2 hours a night because she did not want to waste her life sleeping. She lived at a furious pace, marrying multiple times and burning through experiences with a recklessness that thrilled the public and the press. But that same recklessness destroyed her. Barbara Lamar became addicted to drugs, and her health collapsed under the strain of her extravagant life. She died in 1926 at just 29 years old, of tuberculosis and nephritis worsened by her addiction and crash dieting, one of the first great casualties of Hollywood excess. Her death, coming amid a string of early Hollywood tragedies, contributed to the growing public sense that fame in the movie colony could be deadly. She was interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and though she was one of the most famous women in America at her peak, her name faded quickly, and today the girl who was too beautiful rests largely forgotten, her once dazzling fame reduced to a footnote in the chronicles of early Hollywood's many doomed and haunted stars. We travel now to honor one of the greatest drummers in the history of jazz, a beloved swing-era bandleader whose influence and tragic early death have been overshadowed by time. Chick Webb, one of the greatest drummers in the history of jazz and a beloved bandleader of the swing era, whose enormous influence and tragic early death from illness have been overshadowed by time. He was born in Baltimore around 1905 and, despite suffering from a spinal condition that left him small and hunched and in lifelong pain, he became one of the most powerful and celebrated drummers in all of jazz, leading a legendary band at Harlem's Savoy Ballroom and famously defeating rival bands in the era's celebrated battles of the bands. He discovered and mentored the young Ella Fitzgerald, giving the future legend her start and helping to launch one of the greatest careers in music history. Chick Webb was, by common consent among musicians, one of the finest drummers who ever lived, admired and imitated by everyone in the field. But his fragile health finally failed him. Chick Webb died in 1939, at only around 34 years old, of complications from his spinal condition. His brilliant career cut tragically short. Though he was mourned by the jazz world, his fame faded in the decades that followed as swing gave way to newer styles, and the pioneering drummer who had shaped the music and launched Ella Fitzgerald's career slipped from popular memory. His contributions known today mainly to jazz historians and to the drummers who still study the innovations of one of the instrument's earliest and greatest masters. We travel now to honor a Danish-born actor who became a major silent film star, only to be destroyed by the coming of sound and to die by his own hand in poverty. Carl Dane, a Danish-born actor who became a major star of silent films, only to be destroyed by the coming of sound and to die by his own hand in poverty and obscurity. He was born in Copenhagen in 1886 and came to America, where he became a beloved comic star of the silent era, most famously in the enormous hit The Big Parade, his expressive face and gift for physical comedy, making him a favorite of audiences and a highly paid star at the height of the 1920s. But Carl Dane spoke with a thick Danish accent, and when the movies learned to talk, his career was destroyed almost overnight, the studios abandoning him because audiences could not understand his speech. He fell from wealth and fame into desperate poverty with shocking speed. Unable to find any acting work, the former star was reduced to working as a mechanic and, heartbreakingly, to running a hot dog stand outside the very studio where he had once been a celebrated star. Consumed by despair over his ruined career and his poverty, Carl Dane died by suicide in 1934 at just 47 years old, shooting himself in his small rented room. He had almost nothing to his name. He was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and for a man who had once been a beloved star, his grave and his tragic story faded quickly, a chilling example of how swiftly the coming of sound erased the silent stars who could not survive it. We travel now to honor one of the most important and influential blues musicians of the 1920s, a hugely popular recording artist whose grave in Texas lay unmarked for decades. Blind Lemon Jefferson, one of the most important and influential blues musicians of the 1920s, a hugely popular recording artist whose songs shaped the entire genre, and whose grave in Texas lay unmarked for decades. He was born blind in Texas around 1893 and became the most successful and influential male blues singer of the 1920s. His high, keening voice and distinctive guitar style making him a star whose records sold in enormous numbers and who influenced virtually every bluesman who followed. He was one of the first commercially successful country blues recording artists, a genuine pioneer whose impact on American music was profound and lasting. But Blind Lemon Jefferson died mysteriously in Chicago in 1929, at around 36 years old, reportedly found frozen in the snow during a blizzard. The exact circumstances of his death never fully explained. His body was returned to Texas and buried in a cemetery near his birthplace, but his grave went unmarked for decades, the influential pioneer lying nameless, despite his enormous importance. One of his own songs had pleaded that his grave be kept clean, a haunting request that went unheeded for years until admirers finally placed a marker, honoring at last the blind Texas genius who had helped invent the recorded blues. We travel now, for our final grave, to honor the mother of the blues, one of the earliest and most influential professional blues singers in history, whose grave went unmarked for many years. Ma Rainey, the mother of the blues, one of the earliest and most influential professional blues singers in history, whose powerful performances shaped the genre and whose grave went unmarked for many years. She was born Gertrude Pridgett in Georgia around 1886 and became one of the first great blues stars, a commanding and flamboyant performer who toured the South for decades and made influential recordings in the 1920s, mentoring the young Bessie Smith and helping to define the very sound of classic blues. She was a bold, independent, and groundbreaking woman, unapologetic in her artistry and her life, and her influence on American music was profound, earning her the enduring title of the Mother of the Blues. She performed and recorded prolifically at the height of her fame, a beloved and towering figure. But when the Depression and changing tastes ended the classic blues era, Ma Rainey retired to her native Georgia, and when she died in 1939, at around 53 years old, of heart disease, her fame had already faded. She was buried in the family plot in Columbus, Georgia, and though she was one of the most important figures in the history of the blues, her grave went unmarked or poorly marked for many years, the mother of the blues lying in quiet obscurity until later generations finally recognized and honored the towering pioneer who had helped give American music one of its greatest forms. We travel now to honor one of the greatest and most influential musicians in American history, a blues and folk legend whose songs became national treasures, and whose grave lay unmarked for years. Leadbelly, born Huddie Ledbetter in Louisiana around 1888, was a towering figure of American folk and blues music, a master of the 12-string guitar whose enormous repertoire and powerful voice preserved and shaped the American songbook. His songs, including Goodnight Irene, The Midnight Special, and Cotton Fields, became standards recorded by countless artists, and his influence on folk and rock music is impossible to overstate, reaching directly to the folk revival and beyond. But Leadbelly's life was as turbulent as his music was beautiful. He served time in prison for violent crimes, twice reportedly winning his release through the power of songs he composed and sang for the governors who held his fate, an almost mythical testament to his musical gifts. Discovered by folklorists while imprisoned, he was recorded extensively and brought north, where he became a beloved, if never wealthy, figure of the folk world. Leadbelly died in 1949 at around 61 of the degenerative disease ALS in New York City, in poverty despite his monumental influence. His body was returned to Louisiana and buried near his birthplace. And for a man whose songs became American standards, whose music shaped generations, his grave went without a proper marker for years, the folk and blues giant lying in relative obscurity in the Louisiana earth, until admirers finally erected a stone worthy of one of the most important musicians the nation ever produced, a chilling neglect of a true American original. We travel now to honor a haunting and mysterious figure of the Delta blues, a musician of profound influence whose troubled life ended in obscurity and whose grave was long unknown. Son House, born in Mississippi around 1902, was one of the most powerful and influential of all the Delta blues musicians. A former preacher whose raw, impassioned singing and slashing slide guitar directly shaped the styles of both Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters, placing him at the very headwaters of the blues tradition. He preached and performed in an agonized tension between the sacred and the profane his entire life, and his intense, emotional performances were unlike anything else in the music.
Headstone recorded a handful of sides in the 1930s and 1940s and then vanished into obscurity, presumed by many to be dead.
Then, in the 1960s, like several of his peers, Son House was astonishingly rediscovered by young folk and blues enthusiasts, and brought to national and international fame late in life, performing at festivals and concerts to audiences who revered him as a living link to the origins of the blues. But the years and hard living had taken their toll, and his health and memory declined. Son House died in 1988 at around 86, in Detroit, far from the Mississippi Delta that had birthed his music. He was buried there, and for a time his grave was little marked and little known, the towering blues progenitor who had shaped the entire tradition resting in quiet obscurity in a northern city, his monumental importance to American music known chiefly to the devoted, a haunting silence around the grave of one of the founders of the blues. We travel now to honor a beloved and eccentric genius of the country blues, a singer of eerie, high-voiced brilliance whose difficult life ended in poverty and whose grave lay unmarked. Skip James, born in Mississippi around 1902, was one of the most distinctive and haunting voices in all of the blues, a singer and guitarist whose eerie falsetto, unusual guitar tunings, and dark, otherworldly songs set him utterly apart from every other bluesman of his era. His 1,931 recordings, including Devil Got My Woman and Hard Time Killing Floor Blues, are among the most haunting and admired in the entire blues canon, though they sold poorly at the time and he soon abandoned music for the ministry and obscurity. Like Son House and Mississippi John Hurt, Skip James was rediscovered in the 1960s by young enthusiasts who found him in a Mississippi hospital, and he was brought to the folk revival, where his strange, beautiful music finally found the audience it deserved. His song was even covered by a famous rock band, bringing him a measure of income in his final years. But Skip James was already ill with cancer when he was rediscovered, and the fame came too late to change a life of hardship. Skip James died in 1969 at around 67 of cancer in Philadelphia. He was buried there, and for a man whose haunting music is now considered among the greatest the blues ever produced, his grave went unmarked for years, the eerie genius lying nameless until admirers finally placed a stone. A chilling silence around one of the most singular artists in American music. We travel now to honor a pioneering woman of the blues whose bold artistry and independent spirit made her a legend, and whose grave went unmarked after a life of hardship. Memphis Minnie, born Lizzie Douglas in Louisiana around 1897, was one of the most successful, influential, and long-lived of all the classic blues artists, a fierce and gifted guitarist and singer who competed with and bested the men of her field across a career that spanned decades. She was a genuine pioneer, one of the few women of her era to be celebrated as an instrumentalist rather than only a singer, and her sharp guitar playing and confident, worldly songs influenced generations of blues and rock musicians who followed. She recorded prolifically and remained a popular performer through the 1930s and 1940s. Tough, independent, trailblazing woman in a world dominated by men. But as tastes changed and the classic blues faded, Memphis Minnie fell on hard times. Her health declined, she suffered strokes that ended her ability to perform, and she spent her final years in poverty in a nursing home in Memphis, largely forgotten by the music world she had helped to shape. Memphis Minnie died in 1973 at around 76, after years of illness and obscurity. She was buried near Memphis, and for one of the greatest and most influential women in the history of the blues, her grave went unmarked for years, the trailblazing guitarist lying nameless until the blues musician Bonnie Raitt and others finally paid for a proper headstone, honoring at last the pioneering woman whose fierce artistry had opened doors for so many. We travel now to honor a blind street singer and guitarist of extraordinary gifts, a bluesman whose intricate playing influenced generations and whose grave lay long unmarked. Blind Willie McTell, born in Georgia around 1898, was one of the most gifted and versatile of all the country blues musicians. A blind 12-string guitarist of dazzling technical skill whose smooth voice and intricate playing set him apart from his rougher Delta contemporaries. He recorded across 3 decades under many different names, a working musician who played on the streets of Atlanta and wherever he could earn a living, and his beautiful, complex music, including his signature Statesboro Blues, would later be celebrated and covered by rock musicians who revered him. He was a wandering, independent figure, traveling widely despite his blindness, respected by all who encountered him for his musicianship and his sharp mind. But like so many of the great bluesmen, blind Willie McTell earned little from his enormous talent and lived a hard life. In his final years, his health declined, and he suffered from diabetes and strokes. Blind Willie McTell died in 1959 at around 61, in Georgia, having returned in his last years to preaching. He was buried in a Georgia cemetery, and for a man whose music is now considered among the finest the blues ever produced, and whose name was immortalized in song by Bob Dylan, his grave went unmarked for years, at first bearing the wrong name entirely, the brilliant blind guitarist lying in obscurity until admirers finally corrected and honored his resting place, a chilling neglect of one of the true masters. We travel now to honor a beloved and tragic figure of early jazz, a brilliant cornet player whose genius burned brightly before drink and hard living destroyed him, leaving him in an unmarked grave. Bix Beiderbecke, born in Iowa in 1903, was one of the first great white jazz musicians and one of the most beloved and influential cornet players in the history of the music, a lyrical, gifted improviser whose warm, bell-like tone and melodic genius made him a legend among musicians, even in his own short lifetime. He rose to fame in the 1920s, playing in the top dance bands of the era, and his beautiful, introspective style influenced countless musicians and made him a romantic symbol of the jazz age. He was also a gifted composer, and his artistry was admired by jazz players of every background. But Bix Beiderbecke was consumed by alcoholism, a disease that steadily destroyed his health and his career even as his legend grew. His drinking spiraled out of control, and his body gave out under the strain. Bix Beiderbecke died in 1931 at just 28 years old, alone in a rented apartment in New York, of pneumonia worsened by years of hard drinking. One of the first great tragedies of jazz and a model for the doomed, self-destructive jazz genius. His body was returned to Iowa and buried in the family plot. Though he came from a comfortable family and his grave was marked, his early death and the passing decades left his memory to fade. The brilliant young cornet player whose lyrical genius shaped jazz resting quietly in his Iowa hometown, remembered chiefly by the musicians and devotees who still cherish his beautiful, haunting recordings. We travel now to honor a legendary and mysterious bluesman whose recordings are treasured, and whose life and death are so obscure that even his grave is uncertain. Few of the Delta bluesmen are as shrouded in mystery as our subject now. Tommy Johnson, born in Mississippi around 1896, was one of the most influential and haunting of the early Delta blues musicians, a powerful singer and guitarist whose eerie falsetto and dark, memorable songs, including Canned Heat Blues and Big Road Blues, influenced generations of blues musicians and even lent their name to a famous rock band. He was, like Robert Johnson, to whom he was unrelated, surrounded by the legend that he had sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads in exchange for his musical gift, a myth that attached itself to the most gifted and mysterious of the Delta players. He was a spellbinding performer, famous for his showmanship, but his life was consumed by a devastating addiction to alcohol, including the drinking of dangerous substitutes during Prohibition that inspired his most famous song. Tommy Johnson died in 1956 at around 60 in Mississippi. His career long faded and his life shortened by his addiction. And in a chilling reflection of how completely the world had forgotten him, Tommy Johnson was buried in an unmarked grave in a small Mississippi cemetery, his resting place unknown for decades. It was not until 2018, more than 60 years after his death, that admirers finally erected an elaborate headstone honoring the influential bluesman, ending at last the long anonymity of one of the Delta's most haunting and mysterious voices. We travel now to honor a pioneering figure of gospel and blues whose powerful music shaped American religious song and whose grave lay long neglected. Washington Phillips, born in Texas around 1880, was one of the most unusual and beautiful voices in all of early American religious music. A gospel singer who accompanied himself on a rare and mysterious zither-like instrument, creating a sound so gentle and otherworldly that his handful of surviving recordings are treasured as among the most beautiful ever made. He was a preacher and musician who performed at revivals and on the streets of rural Texas, and the dozen or so sides he recorded in the late 1920s, including his masterpiece Denomination Blues, reveal an artist of profound spiritual depth and haunting originality, utterly unlike anyone else in recorded music. For decades, even his true identity and fate were confused and mistaken by historians, so obscure had he become. Washington Phillips lived out his life in rural Texas in complete obscurity, his brief recording career long forgotten, working as a farmer far from any recognition. He died in 1954 at around 74, reportedly after a fall, in Texas, utterly unknown to the wider world that would one day treasure his music. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a rural Texas cemetery, his resting place lost. The gentle gospel visionary whose otherworldly recordings are now considered national treasures, lying nameless in the earth of his home state. A chilling anonymity around one of the most singular and beautiful artists in the history of American music, remembered now only by the devoted few who have fallen under the spell of his haunting songs. We travel now to honor a pioneering banjo genius of early country music whose hard living cut his brilliant career short, his grave long, modest, and little visited. Charlie Poole, born in North Carolina in 1892, was one of the most influential and beloved early country musicians. A banjo player of remarkable skill whose three-finger picking style influenced the entire future of the instrument and whose band, the North Carolina Ramblers, made hugely popular recordings in the 1920s. A charismatic and hard-living mill worker turned musician, Poole was famous both for his musical brilliance and for his prodigious drinking. A wild and colorful figure whose recordings sold in enormous numbers and shaped the emerging sound of country music. His influence on banjo playing and on the string band tradition was profound and lasting, reaching directly to the bluegrass and old-time music that followed. But Charlie Poole's hard living caught up with him. After receiving an offer to go to Hollywood, he reportedly embarked on a weeks-long celebratory drinking binge that proved fatal. Charlie Poole died in 1931 at just 39 years old, of heart failure brought on by his catastrophic drinking, his brilliant career cut short at its height. He was buried in North Carolina, and for a man who had been one of the best-selling and most influential country musicians of his era, his grave was long, modest, and little visited. The pioneering banjo genius, whose style shaped an entire tradition resting in quiet obscurity in his home state, his monumental contributions to American music, known today mainly to devoted students of country's earliest and most influential recording pioneers. We travel now to honor a remarkable self-taught folk and blues musician whose upside-down guitar style gave the world one of its most beloved songs, recognition coming only very late. Elizabeth Cotten, born in North Carolina around 1893, was a remarkable and beloved folk and blues musician whose self-taught, upside-down guitar style and beautiful compositions made her a treasure of American music, though recognition came only very late in her long life. Left-handed, she taught herself to play a right-handed guitar upside down, developing a wholly unique finger-picking style, and as a young girl, she composed her masterpiece, the song "Freight Train," which would become a folk standard recorded around the world. But she set music aside for most of her life, working as a domestic servant for decades, her genius unknown. Astonishingly, she was discovered late in life while working for the musical Seeger family, who recognized her extraordinary gifts. And in her 60s and beyond, she finally launched a performing and recording career, becoming a beloved figure of the folk revival and eventually winning a Grammy in her 90s. Elizabeth Cotten died in 1987 at around 94, having at last received the recognition her genius deserved, a rare happy ending among these tragic stories. She was buried in Syracuse, New York, far from her Carolina birthplace. Yet for a woman whose freight train is sung around the world, whose influence on folk guitar is immense, her grave received relatively little attention for years. The self-taught genius who gave the world one of its most beloved songs resting quietly in a northern cemetery, her monumental and hard-won legacy still deserving of far wider recognition than the world has given her. We travel now to honor one of the greatest cornet players of early jazz, a founding giant whose refusal to record may have cost him lasting fame, his grave long unmarked. Freddie Keppard, born in New Orleans in 1890, was one of the greatest and most powerful cornet players of early jazz, a legendary figure who, according to jazz lore, was so protective of his innovations that he reportedly turned down the chance to make the first jazz recording, fearing others would steal his style, thus losing his shot at the immortality that recording would have granted. He was, by the accounts of those who heard him, one of the most powerful and brilliant cornet players in the early history of jazz, a rival to the legends, a commanding presence who carried the New Orleans tradition to Chicago and beyond. But Freddie Keppard, like so many of the early jazz pioneers, was consumed by alcoholism, which destroyed his health and his career as the music moved on to newer styles and younger players. He declined into obscurity and hard drinking in Chicago. Freddie Keppard died in 1933 at just 43 years old, of complications from his alcoholism. His brilliant career long faded, and his fame eclipsed by the players who had recorded when he would not. He was buried in Chicago, and for one of the founding giants of jazz cornet, a man whose refusal to record may have cost him lasting fame, his grave went long, unmarked, and neglected, the powerful pioneer lying in obscurity, a chilling reminder of how the earliest architects of jazz so often ended forgotten, their innovations living on in a music that had left their names behind. We travel now to honor one of the most influential guitarists in the history of American music, a virtuoso who essentially invented the guitar solo, his grave unmarked for decades. Lonnie Johnson, born in New Orleans around 1894, was one of the most influential and versatile guitarists in the entire history of American music, a pioneer whose sophisticated, single-string soloing essentially invented the vocabulary of the guitar solo that would define blues, jazz, and rock for the next century. He was a genuine virtuoso, equally at home in blues and jazz, who recorded with the greatest names of his era and whose innovations influenced virtually every guitarist who followed. From the bluesmen to the jazz players to the rock stars, he enjoyed real success across several decades, a working professional whose gifts kept him employed through changing musical fashions, and he was rediscovered and celebrated during the blues revival of the 1960s. But despite his monumental influence, Lonnie Johnson never received the lasting fame or fortune his innovations deserved. In his final years, after being struck by a car, his health declined, Lonnie Johnson died in 1970 at around 76 in Toronto, where he had settled late in life. He was buried there. And for a man whose guitar innovations shaped the sound of the entire 20th century, whose influence is present in every blues and rock solo ever played, his grave went unmarked for decades, the pioneering virtuoso lying nameless in a Canadian cemetery, until admirers finally raised the funds to honor him, a chilling neglect of one of the most important and influential musicians America ever produced. We travel now to honor one of the most important early Atlanta blues musicians, a doubly disabled pioneer who died in the poverty that shadowed his life, his grave long neglected. Peg Leg Howell, born in Georgia in 1888, was one of the most important early Atlanta blues musicians, a gifted singer and guitarist who lost his leg in a shooting as a young man, giving him his enduring nickname, and who became a significant recording artist in the 1920s, bridging older songster traditions and the emerging blues. His recordings captured a vital transitional moment in the development of the blues, and his music influenced the Atlanta blues scene and beyond, a genuine pioneer of the recorded blues in the American Southeast. But the Depression ended his recording career, and Peg Leg Howell fell into deep obscurity and hardship, his music forgotten, spending decades in poverty. Diabetes eventually cost him his remaining leg, leaving him destitute and confined. He was rediscovered, poor and ill, in the 1960s, and made a final recording, a brief flicker of recognition near the end of a hard life. Peg Leg Howell died in 1966, at around 78, in Atlanta, in the poverty that had shadowed most of his life. He was buried in Georgia, and for an influential pioneer of the Atlanta blues, his grave went long, unmarked, and neglected. The doubly disabled bluesman who had helped shape a regional tradition lying nameless in the earth, a chilling silence around another of the forgotten black pioneers whose music helped build one of America's greatest art forms, while the country gave them so little in return, in life or in death. We travel now to honor a blind fiddler and songwriter whose sharp, socially conscious songs made him a distinctive voice in early country music, his grave long unmarked. Blind Alfred Reed, born in West Virginia in 1880, was a blind fiddler, singer, and songwriter whose sharp, socially conscious songs made him one of the most distinctive voices in early country music, his compositions addressing poverty, injustice, and hard times with a directness that was rare for his era. His most famous song, How Can a Poor Man Stand Such Times and Live, written during the Great Depression, became an enduring anthem of hard times, covered and admired generations later for its unflinching honesty about the struggles of the poor. A blind musician who supported his family through his fiddle and his songs, Reed recorded a handful of powerful sides in the late 1920s that captured a vanishing rural world with wit and moral force. But the depression that he sang about so powerfully also ended his recording career, and blind Alfred Reed spent his final decades in obscurity and hardship in rural West Virginia, his music largely forgotten. He reportedly was even forbidden by authorities from playing his fiddle on the street to earn a living in his final years, a cruel blow to a blind man with few other means. Blind Alfred Reed died in 1956 at around 76 in poverty in West Virginia. He was buried in a rural cemetery, and for a songwriter whose Depression anthem still resonates today, his grave went long, unmarked, and little known. The blind fiddler poet lying in obscurity in the West Virginia hills, his prophetic songs about the struggles of the poor outliving the memory of the impoverished man who wrote them. We travel now, for our final grave, to honor one of the most beloved of the early Memphis bluesmen, a warm and gifted songster laid to rest in a grave that went unmarked for years. Furry Lewis, born in Mississippi around 1893 and raised in Memphis, was one of the most beloved and enduring of the early Memphis blues musicians, a gifted slide, guitarist, and singer whose warm, engaging performances and long life made him a cherished link to the origins of the blues. He lost a leg in a train-hopping accident as a young man but continued to perform, recording in the 1920s before, like so many others, fading into obscurity and working for decades as a street sweeper for the city of Memphis. And like his peers, Furry Lewis was rediscovered during the blues revival of the 1960s, when his charm, humor, and musicianship made him a beloved figure, and he enjoyed a remarkable late-life career, even opening for the Rolling Stones and appearing on national television, becoming perhaps the most famous of the rediscovered bluesmen. He was a warm, funny, endearing performer who won the affection of everyone who met him. Furry Lewis died in 1981 at around 88 in Memphis, the city he had swept and serenaded for so long. He was buried there, and yet, in a final chilling irony for one of the most beloved of all the rediscovered bluesmen, Furry Lewis was laid to rest in a grave that went unmarked for years, the cherished Memphis songster lying nameless until admirers finally placed a stone, ensuring that the warm and gifted pioneer who had brought the old blues to a new generation would not lie forgotten in the Memphis earth he had called home for nearly a century. Celebrities and legends, laid in the ground with nothing to mark the spot. No stone, no name, no dates. What connects them is the chilling silence of the unmarked grave. So many were poor, or black, or both, in a country that did not value them. Robert Johnson and Buddy Bolden and Charlie Patton and Bessie Smith and Blind Willie Johnson and Scott Joplin, giants of American music laid in nameless graves, while the art they created went on to conquer the world. So many were stars the industry used up and discarded. Florence Lawrence, the very first movie star, nameless for 50 years. Bobby Driscoll, who was Peter Pan, in a mass grave on a prison island. Carl Dane, destroyed by sound, forgotten in the ground. They gave the world music and laughter and beauty and art, and they received, in return, an anonymous patch of earth, their names erased, their resting places lost. Some were finally given headstones, decades too late, by admirers who could not bear the silence. Some lie nameless still, their true graves lost forever. What we can do, tonight and every night, is remember them, learn their names, speak them aloud, think of the specific ground where each of them lies, marked or unmarked, known or lost. It costs us nothing, and it is the one thing we can still offer those who were given so little in death after giving so much in life. They built our music and our movies and our memories. The least we can do is not forget where they came to rest, even when no stone remembers them. Thank you for walking with me. Rest well, and if you pass a cemetery in the coming week and you have a moment, stop and read a name, any name. Someone was loved once who is buried there, and somewhere nearby, perhaps, someone lies with no name at all. It costs us nothing to remember them, and it may be the only thing that keeps any of us from disappearing entirely. Good night, friends.